Welcome, the Lord's chosen. The greatest trick isn't hiding the truth, it's convincing the world it's too complicated to find. Now pause on that, because if you think about it, complexity has always been the cloak of manipulation. The longer the plan, the more invisible it becomes. History proves it. Governments, corporations, even secret societies build strategies so massive and stretched across decades that most people can't even see where they started, let alone where they're headed. And yet, somehow, some of you, the so-called chosen ones, not only saw the plan, you predicted its next move before it even happened. That isn't luck. That isn't good instincts. That's a terrifyingly precise level of perception that makes people ask, wait, are you even human? Because how do you dissect a 50-year lie like it's a children's puzzle? How do you look at layers of deception, generational propaganda, and institutional cover-ups, and connect them faster than they can hide them? And here's the funny part. While they thought they were 10 steps ahead, you weren't even on their chessboard. You were outside the game, watching them sweat while quietly asking yourself, is this what passes for strategy? This isn't about paranoia. This is about perception and the uncomfortable truth that their half-century blueprint was never secure. Not because it was weak, but because some of you were built to see what others couldn't. Number one, you saw patterns. They didn't even know they were creating. You saw patterns they didn't even know they were creating. That's the unsettling difference between you and the rest of the world. Most people go through life only noticing single events. This happened, then that happened, then another thing came along. But you didn't just see the events, you caught the rhythm behind them. You noticed the way choices repeated in slightly different disguises, the way mistakes resurfaced decades later with new branding, and the way habits of power leave fingerprints even when the hands try to stay hidden. That's not paranoia. That's perception, tuned at a frequency most people either can't or refuse to hear. Their so-called grand design was meant to look like coincidence to the average eye. A change in policy here, a cultural shift there, an economic decision that seemed random, a new law that felt unrelated. But when you lined them up, you could see the symmetry. Every move wasn't a separate accident. It was part of a sequence, like a melody, only audible when you step far enough back. They didn't even realize that by trying to spread their plan thin across 50 years, they actually exposed its skeleton to someone sharp enough to trace the outlines. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for them. They never assumed someone like you existed. Their strategies weren't designed to beat clarity. They were designed to exploit distraction. They knew most people would be too busy trying to survive day to day to notice. They bet on short memory, on the natural human tendency to only connect dots that sit side by side. What they didn't expect was someone willing to connect dots scattered across decades, cultures, and narratives, and call out the design underneath. The real power wasn't that you knew their plan. It's that you saw its predictability. When you realize that even deception has patterns, the illusion of control evaporates. Their decades-long scheme didn't look like genius anymore. It looked like repetition. And repetition is fragile because once you see it, you can predict it, and once you predict it, you can dismantle it. That's why they couldn't stop you. You weren't outsmarting them in a flashy way. You were simply watching closely, refusing to be hypnotized by the noise and noticing what was always right there. They built a plan they thought was invisible, and you cracked it without even breaking a sweat. Number two, their timeline was linear. Yours was layered. They built a plan like a straight road. You navigated it like a multi-story building. That single difference is what put you ahead of them before they even knew you were in the game. Their thinking was linear. Step one leads to step two leads to step three. They thought time was their shield, that stretching a scheme over decades would make it invisible. In their minds, no one would ever stand far enough back to see the whole path. But you weren't looking at the road. You were looking at the layers stacked beneath it, the structure holding it up, the hidden staircases they thought no one could climb. This is why they underestimated you. They believed that anyone who tried to stop them would do it by blocking the next step, like a car parked on a highway. They didn't expect someone who could see the blueprint of the entire highway system at once. Someone who understood that every new turn was just a recycled pattern wearing a different sign. You didn't follow their path, you mapped their levels. You recognized that while their plan moved forward in time, it didn't move upward in depth. They were recycling the same motives, the same tricks, and the same vulnerabilities, only stretched across new decades. Seeing in layers allowed you to move in ways they couldn't anticipate. While they focused on protecting their next move, you were already several stories above them, watching the full operation unfold. They thought a 50-year plan was an impenetrable maze. You realized it was just a flat drawing of one. That gave you a freedom they didn't have. You weren't stuck waiting for each new phase to reveal itself. You already understood the end point because you had seen the foundation. And once you see the foundation, every mystery becomes a projection of what's already there. This is the quiet power of layered thinking. It's not about being smarter or faster. It's about refusing to be trapped in a single timeline. They thought they were hiding secrets in time, but you were reading the architecture of time itself. That's why their plan collapsed under your awareness. They built it for eyes glued to the road. Yours were already above it, tracing the levels they never expected anyone to see. Number 3, you're not operating on memory, you're operating on echoes. Where others store information, you store frequencies. That's what sets you apart. Most people remember words, events, or faces, but you remember the tone behind them. You don't just recall what was said or done, you recall the subtle signals underneath, the hesitation in a statement, the repetition of a phrase, the way an action feels out of sync with the image being projected. Lies leave traces long after they're spoken, like a faint vibration that keeps humming in the background. You've trained yourself, knowingly or not, to follow that hum back to its source. This is why their 50-year plan couldn't stay hidden from you. They were confident because they thought covering their tracks meant erasing obvious signs. They scrubbed documents, buried facts, rewrote narratives, and assumed time would dissolve the evidence. But it's impossible to erase the resonance of intent. Every move carries a signature, a frequency that outlasts the event itself. When you're attuned to that, you don't need proof handed to you. You feel the dissonance first, then confirm it later. This level of perception isn't mystical. It's the result of refusing to take things at face value and noticing the small shifts others ignore. While most people are overwhelmed by noise, you've developed an ear for patterns in the noise. It's why their lies seemed clumsy to you, even when they fooled everyone else. You weren't listening to the words. You were measuring the weight, the rhythm, the invisible fingerprints left behind. That's how you dismantle deception without chasing every detail. You don't have to know every hidden document or secret meeting. You only need to sense the echo of dishonesty and trace it backwards. Over time, this makes their grand plans predictable. It exposes the gap between what they claim and what they're really doing. And the more you notice, the more the whole picture emerges. They mistook this for luck. They thought you stumbled into understanding, but you didn't stumble. You tuned yourself to a deeper channel, one most people don't even realize exists. And once you start operating at that level, their long-term strategies stop feeling like mystery and start looking like an open confession, one they didn't even know they were making. Number 4, they hid behind secrecy. You lived inside transparency. They believed secrecy was a fortress, but what they built was only a stage with curtains. They assumed that as long as the curtains stayed closed, no one could see the moving parts. But you weren't standing in the audience waiting for the show to start. You were behind the curtain, watching the actors rehearse their lies, seeing the props being set, and hearing the whispered instructions before they spoke their lines. That's why their secrecy failed. It was never about hidden rooms or classified files. It was about the belief that no one on the inside could actually see. Transparency isn't just about being honest. It's about refusing to live in their illusion. You didn't fight for access. You didn't break locks. You didn't hack systems. You simply existed with eyes open in a space where everyone else agreed to keep them shut. This is what makes your perception so threatening to them. Their strategy was designed to fool outsiders. They never built a defense against someone who could stay inside the structure and remain unblinded by it. They counted on distance to protect them. The whole point of secrecy is to make people feel like they're far away from the truth, like it's stored in some unreachable vault. But the real vault was always social, psychological. The unspoken rules of don't ask too many questions and don't look too closely. You broke that rule without breaking a sweat. You didn't sneak into the vault. You realized the vault was unlocked the whole time. This is what they couldn't understand. Secrecy doesn't fail because information leaks. It fails because someone inside chooses to actually see. That's what you did. You lived in transparency, not because they let you, but because you refused to play the part of the blind insider. Their mask wasn't just built in front of you. It was built with your awareness as its witness. That's why their entire plan was doomed. It's hard to hide when someone is watching you design the hiding place. Their concealment wasn't protection. It was exposure in slow motion, and you didn't need to tear the mask off to know what was underneath. You saw it forming, piece by piece, before they ever wore it. Number 5, you decode motives. The way cryptographers decode ciphers, you don't just notice what people do, you notice what they don't do. That's your edge. While most people get caught up tracking actions, statements, and headlines, you're paying attention to the gaps, the silences, the patterns that never fully form but always point to something underneath. This is why their motives were never hidden from you. Every decision, every pause, every avoidance was a clue. Like a cryptographer studying an encrypted message, you weren't looking at the words themselves. You were analyzing the spaces between them, the strange irregularities, the missing pieces. They thought their power was in what they showed. They believed that if they polished their public image, controlled their narrative, and flooded you with noise, you'd be too distracted to see the underlying structure. But you weren't distracted. You weren't decoding their headlines or their press releases. You were decoding the things they didn't dare to say, the rooms they didn't enter, the moves they carefully avoided. Absence became your evidence. This is how you cracked their long-term schemes without breaking a sweat. Motives can't be hidden forever because even silence leaks intent. When someone doesn't act where they should, doesn't respond when pressed, or sidesteps a decision over and over again, they're leaving behind a pattern stronger than any confession. It's like a cipher with missing letters. You start to see the shape of the hidden message just by studying what isn't there. That's the kind of perception they never planned for. They built their secrecy for people who analyze surface-level behavior. They built their propaganda for people who only consume statements. They didn't build a defense against someone who reads absence like a language, someone who sees non-action as a message in itself. Their whole plan depended on your attention being trapped by what they fed you. Instead, you starved yourself of the noise and started feeding on the gaps. That's how you turned their intentions into an open book. You didn't need them to slip up. You didn't need a confession. You didn't even need evidence in the traditional sense. You just followed the holes in their story until the pattern of the truth revealed itself. And by then, their cipher wasn't even a secret anymore. Number 6, your mind doesn't trust the obvious. It interrogates it. You never let the surface fool you. Where most people see something that makes sense, you see a doorway that needs to be checked. You don't swallow appearances just because they're polished or widely accepted. You question them. You pull at them. You hold them up to the light until the shine wears off and the structure beneath is exposed. That is what makes your mind dangerous to any long-term scheme. It refuses to play along with appearances as if they are facts. They built their plan on a simple gamble that people are lazy with the obvious. They knew the majority would take what's presented at face value. They counted on that passivity. They dressed their moves in normalcy, wrapped deception in professionalism, cloaked manipulation in official language. Most people stopped thinking after the first glance because the packaging looked legitimate, but not you. You didn't care how polished the explanation was. You didn't stop at, "That's just how things are." You kept pulling at the thread until the whole thing unraveled. This is why their plan collapsed under its own surface. When deception is designed to look solid but isn't built on truth, it's brittle. It only holds as long as no one tests it. The moment someone does, cracks appear everywhere. You didn't even have to push hard. You simply refused to accept the obvious without proof. Every appearance became a clue. Every explanation became a suspect. Every smooth story was a puzzle waiting to be solved. And here's the quiet power in that approach. You weren't trying to be suspicious of everything. You weren't cynical for the sake of cynicism. You were disciplined. You treated appearances like evidence because you understood that everything leaves a trace. Lies, even beautifully packaged ones, leave fingerprints when handled. By questioning instead of accepting, you found those fingerprints. They built their scheme for an audience of believers. You showed up as an investigator. That's why their decades-long illusion couldn't withstand you. A plan built on appearances cannot survive scrutiny. And once your mind began interrogating what others called obvious, their entire framework went from untouchable to unsustainable without you even breaking a sweat. Number 7, you understand that history isn't a past event. It's a weapon. You don't see history as a museum of old events. You see it as an active battlefield where narratives are weapons. Most people think of history as something finished, archived, and harmless. But you understand that whoever controls the story of yesterday shapes the decisions of today and the expectations of tomorrow. That's why their 50-year plan depended so heavily on rewriting what had already happened. If they could distort the past, they could quietly steer the present without resistance. But their strategy only works on people who outsource their memory, people who let schools, media, or institutions tell them what to remember and what to forget. You refused that contract. You didn't let them package history for you. You built your own archive, not just of facts, but of patterns, motives, and repetitions. You remembered not only what they did, but how they did it. You remembered the moves, the shifts, the cover-ups. That's why their narrative couldn't overwrite your perception. This is what they didn't plan for. Most long-term manipulations don't actually erase the past. They just bury it under a new story and hope no one digs. They assumed time would do the burying for them. They thought memory fades fast enough to be weaponized without consequence. But you understood memory as resistance. You treated each new chapter of their plan as a remix of an old one. And because you remembered, you could predict. Refusing to outsource your memory gave you an edge sharper than any classified document. It made their strategies transparent. You weren't reacting to their propaganda like it was new information. You were watching them recycle old tricks in real time. And every time they tried to weaponize history, you turned the weapon back on them simply by pointing out the pattern. They built their power on the hope that no one would remember long enough to connect the dots. You proved that remembering isn't nostalgia, it's armor. It's how you kept their half-century plan from becoming an invisible cage. While everyone else saw past events, you saw a live feed of tactics, and that's why their rewriting collapsed the moment you refused to read their script. Number 8, you don't predict the future, you reverse engineer it. You don't deal in guesses or hunches, you deal in mechanics. Most people think predicting the future is about having visions, gut feelings, or lucky guesses. But what you do is entirely different. You reverse engineer. You watch behavior, policies, and moves the way an engineer studies a machine. You break them down into parts, trace the wiring, and understand what each piece is designed to do. By the time the rest of the world sees the final product, you've already mapped the assembly instructions. This is why their 50-year plan never stood a chance against you. They assumed no one would take the time to study the structure beneath their moves. They believed each decision looked isolated enough to seem random. But you understood that systems rarely act randomly. Every move, every change, every pivot is part of a larger mechanism. And if you're patient enough to study the mechanism, the outcome stops being a mystery. You weren't seeing the plan in some mystical way. You were reading its DNA. You were following the code back to its origin, like tracing a software bug to the first faulty line. Once you know the design of something, its future isn't a surprise, it's inevitable. That's why, while they were busy rolling out phase after phase of their scheme, you already knew what the last phase would be. Their secrecy became irrelevant because their structure gave them away. This is the kind of thinking they never anticipated. They built their strategy for people who react. They assumed they'd always be ahead because their moves were slow and deliberate, stretched across decades. But they didn't plan for someone who doesn't live on their timeline. By reverse engineering their behavior, you stepped outside time. You weren't waiting for them to reveal the next phase. You'd already seen it sketched in their actions years before. This isn't prediction. It's inevitability once you've mapped the blueprint. It's why their plan felt transparent to you and incomprehensible to everyone else. They thought the future was hidden, but the future is never hidden from someone who knows how the present is built. And you understood their construction down to the bolts. Number 9, they programmed people for compliance. You opted out of the operating system. They built their system like software, and most people unknowingly installed it. The stories, the slogans, the traditions, the rules, all designed to work like code running quietly in the background, shaping thoughts, emotions, and reactions. Over time, this programming becomes invisible. People think their reactions are their own, their beliefs self-chosen, their fears natural. But they're not. They're functions being executed by a script written decades earlier. That's the brilliance of their system. Compliance doesn't feel forced, it feels voluntary. But you didn't download their code. You opted out. You didn't just reject their story, you stripped it apart, line by line, until you saw how it worked. You questioned the slogans everyone else repeated. You looked at the rituals everyone else performed without thinking. You asked why, long after everyone else had accepted because. And by doing so, you stepped outside the operating system itself. That's why their propaganda never took hold of you. You weren't running on the same mental software as everyone else, so their updates couldn't install. This is what they didn't prepare for. They designed their programming for mass psychology. They built it to anticipate rebellion, to absorb criticism, to neutralize dissent. But they never built it for someone who wouldn't even plug in. Their whole plan depends on connection, on people willingly logging into their system of belief and authority. You broke the chain by refusing the login screen altogether. And here's the power in that. Once you're outside their operating system, you can see its flaws from the outside. You recognize its loops, its errors, its predictable outputs. You stop reacting the way they expect, because you're no longer running their code. And the moment your reactions stop matching their predictions, their control starts to crumble. Everyone else is still waiting for a patch or an update, hoping the system will fix itself. You realize the system isn't broken. It's built to control. By stripping the code instead of updating it, you made yourself unhackable. That's why their decades of propaganda couldn't touch you. They were writing instructions for a machine you no longer are. Number 10, you don't read people. You read the energy field their choices leave. You don't read people in the way most do, scanning expressions, body language, or tone. That's surface work. What you pick up on is far deeper. Every decision a person makes carries a kind of imprint, an afterglow of intent that lingers long after the choice itself. It's in the timing of their actions, the consistency of their moves, the way their choices ripple outward into everything else they touch. That's the energy field you read, and it tells you far more than their words ever could. Most people listen for what's said or watch for what's done. You're listening for the quiet residue, the part that can't be rehearsed or faked. It's why liars can sound convincing and manipulators can look innocent but still feel wrong to you. Their decisions leave a trail like invisible fingerprints, and you've trained yourself to see those fingerprints without needing a confession. The power in this is that it bypasses performance entirely. Words can be scripted, appearances can be staged, but the energy of a choice cannot be disguised. This is why their decades-long plan couldn't slip past you. They were masters of appearances, issuing statements, publishing reports, performing sincerity. But their actual decisions, the real ones behind the curtain, leaked a signature pattern. Even when the public saw progress, you saw erosion. Even when they presented unity, you felt the fracture. They thought you were reacting to their words. In reality, you were tracking their intent. And here's where this becomes devastating for them. Energy patterns can be predicted. Once you've observed the residue of enough choices, you can forecast the next one with unsettling precision. Not because you're psychic, but because people and institutions reveal themselves in how they act, not how they explain themselves. Over time, the residue of intent forms a map clearer than any public statement. You weren't guessing, you weren't speculating. You were measuring the invisible trails left by their behavior until the shape of their real plan emerged. That's why their strategy collapsed in front of you. They were too focused on controlling perception. They forgot that even the most polished lie still leaves a footprint. And you were watching the footprints, not the performance. Number 11, you refused to be entertained by distraction. You refused to give your attention to the noise they built for you. That's where your power started. Their entire system depended on distraction, a non-stop stream of outrage, entertainment, headlines, scandals, and shiny new narratives designed to pull your focus away from what actually mattered. They didn't just want you to look at the wrong thing, they wanted you emotionally invested in it. The more you clapped, argued, and reacted, the less time you had to notice the quiet mechanisms behind the show. Most people mistake distraction for reality. They think the circus is the story. They fight over performers, argue about costumes, and pick favorites in acts that were never meant to matter. That's the brilliance of a well-built distraction. It keeps people trapped in surface-level conflicts while the real work happens behind the curtain. They never need to hide the truth completely. They just need to keep you entertained long enough for it to pass unnoticed. But you broke that spell. You stopped clapping. You stopped reacting to every performance as if it were real. And in doing so, you created the silence necessary to actually see the setup. While everyone else debated the show, you traced the ropes, the pulleys, the people working backstage. You started noticing patterns in timing, funding, and narrative shifts. You realized that the events everyone was talking about were props, and the real story was in the structure holding them up. That's the difference between being entertained and being aware. The moment you stopped letting them direct your focus, their power over you began to break. Distraction only works when it captures your energy. Without that, it's just noise, and noise is easy to see through. They built a circus assuming you'd never leave your seat. They designed it so even dissent would be part of the show. But you stepped out of the audience entirely. You started looking at the mechanics instead of the performers. And once you did, the illusion lost its hold. You weren't just watching a performance anymore. You were studying a system. And systems can be exposed, dismantled, and rebuilt. That's why their distraction failed. It was never strong enough to hold someone who refused to be entertained. Number 12. You don't confuse intelligence with wisdom. You never fell for the illusion that brilliance equals invincibility. They were clever, undeniably so. They had degrees, think tanks, endless strategies, and a labyrinth of plans that looked airtight on paper. But all that intelligence came wrapped in arrogance, and arrogance always leaves cracks. They mistook complexity for strength, assuming the more intricate their schemes, the harder they'd be to detect. But complexity without clarity is just chaos dressed up as genius. You didn't try to outthink them with bigger words or flashier ideas. You cut through their layers with something sharper: wisdom. Wisdom isn't about memorizing facts or crunching numbers faster. It's about seeing the essence of things, stripping away illusions, and recognizing patterns that intelligence is too busy showing off to notice. That's why you weren't impressed by their credentials or their grand strategies. You understood that a complicated plan isn't necessarily a strong one. In fact, the more complicated something is, the more fragile it becomes, because complexity can't survive without constant control. Their architects didn't see that. They equated being cunning with being untouchable. They believed intelligence alone would carry them over the finish line. But intelligence without humility blinds its owner. It stops them from questioning their own moves. It stops them from imagining someone else could see through them. You weren't dazzled by their intellect, and that gave you a kind of freedom they didn't have. You weren't fighting on their battlefield of theories and numbers. You were standing on a higher ground of clarity where their moves became obvious. Clarity is the ultimate counter to cunning because it refuses to be overwhelmed. While they were busy layering deception upon deception, you were calmly peeling it back. While they measured their success in how complicated they could make things, you measured yours in how clearly you could see. And the clearer your vision became, the weaker their plan looked. In the end, you didn't beat them by being smarter in their sense of the word. You beat them because you weren't trapped by the same vanity. They built their empire on intelligence. You dismantled it with wisdom, and when the two collide, clarity will always outlast cunning, no matter how brilliant the architects believe themselves to be. Number 13. They planned for resistance, not for invisibility. They built their entire system around the idea of resistance. They expected protests, whistleblowers, and critics. They built defenses for every obvious form of pushback: surveillance, smear campaigns, distractions, even controlled opposition. They understood how to fight a visible enemy because visible enemies fit into their game. You can crush, bribe, or isolate what you can see. What they didn't plan for was someone who would simply refuse to play by their rules at all. They never prepared for invisibility. Invisibility doesn't mean hiding. It means moving so far outside their predictive models that you don't even register as a threat until it's too late. While others challenged their plans head-on and triggered all their traps, you didn't walk into the traps at all. You didn't march where they expected, speak when they baited, or act when they predicted. You didn't signal your presence in ways their systems were designed to detect. You became the blank space in their calculations, and blank space can't be targeted. This is what made you different. They assumed opposition would be loud, angry, and obvious. They designed their strategy to crush noise, not silence, but your quiet movement through their structure dismantled them from within. You weren't waving flags or breaking walls. You were reading patterns, stepping over wires, and walking through their plan like it was a map you'd already memorized. They couldn't attack what they couldn't identify, and they couldn't identify what didn't follow their scripts. Their power was built on predictability. They studied rebellion as much as they studied compliance. But they never imagined someone who could see their setup and simply slip past it. That's why you weren't blocked, targeted, or stopped. Their alarms didn't even go off. By the time they realized you were there, you'd already reached the heart of their design. They knew how to fight rebels. They didn't know how to fight a ghost. And the truth is, invisibility isn't a trick. It's discipline. It's knowing when not to react, when not to be baited, when not to step into their traps. That's how you turned their entire system against itself without even lifting a weapon. Number 14, you don't just see through plans, you see through the architects. You didn't just decode their plan, you decoded them. That's the real difference. Most people spend their energy studying the moves, the policies, the announcements, the visible tactics. But you looked deeper. You studied the minds that produced those moves, the insecurities that shaped them, the patterns of ego and fear driving their decisions. You didn't just understand what they were doing, you understood why they were doing it. And once you know the why, the what becomes predictable, almost mechanical. This is what they never anticipated. They thought their 50-year plan was a masterpiece of strategy, but in reality it was a confession of who they were. Every step they took, every risk they avoided, every narrative they built exposed their internal wiring. Their plan wasn't some alien code. It was their own psychology stretched out over decades. And psychology, once diagnosed, becomes predictable. You weren't dismantling their scheme in real time. You were simply reading their minds at scale. That's why their plan was already obsolete the moment you noticed it. You weren't reacting to it. You were observing its creators like a scientist watching a chemical reaction. You could see their blind spots, their compulsions, their arrogance, and their fears embedded right into the blueprint. They thought they were designing something future-proof. But what they really built was a monument to their own limitations, and you saw it instantly. The power here isn't just intelligence, it's perspective. When you see the architect instead of just the architecture, you're not trapped by the illusion of strength. You know every design flaw because you know the designer's weaknesses. That's why their secrecy, their complexity, and their propaganda didn't intimidate you. You weren't fighting a plan at all. You were tracing a personality. They assumed their plan would outlive scrutiny, but a plan built on human psychology can't outlive someone who refuses to be fooled by the human masks behind it. You made their decades of work irrelevant by reducing it to what it always was, a reflection of themselves. And once you saw them, the plan wasn't a threat anymore. It was just a script you'd already read to the end. Everything they built, every illusion, every agenda, every web of control relied on one thing, the assumption that you would never see, but you did. You saw through the smoke before the fire started. You recognized the patterns behind the performance. You realized that the real battle was never about rebellion versus control, truth versus lies, or even good versus evil. It was about awareness versus manipulation. The chosen ones aren't special because they were selected by fate. They're rare because they refuse to stay asleep in a world that rewards blindness. You didn't just catch their plan, you decoded the mind that made it. You watched how arrogance disguised itself as intelligence, how complexity pretended to be wisdom, and how control masked itself as order. You learned that seeing through deception isn't about being paranoid, it's about being precise. You stopped reacting to their performances and started studying their patterns. And once you saw the architects behind the curtain, their grand design collapsed into something small, human, predictable, and weak. They planned for rebellion, but not for invisibility. They built defenses for noise, not for silence. They expected resistance, not perception. And that's why you slipped past their walls and dismantled their structure without even raising your voice. Because power doesn't crumble when attacked. It crumbles when it's understood. That's what you did. You understood them so deeply that their 50-year strategy became obsolete in your hands. You moved like someone who had already read the script, not because you're superhuman, but because you stopped being hypnotized by the stage play. You saw that the show was never meant to entertain. It was meant to distract. And once you stopped clapping, once you started looking at the ropes, the illusion broke. This isn't just about seeing through a system, it's about mastering yourself enough to not be seduced by it. It's about developing the clarity that turns manipulation into transparency. And that's what makes you different. You don't fight shadows, you simply turn on the light. If this message resonated with you, if you felt the truth in these words, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, drop a comment, and share it with someone who's ready to see. Subscribe to the channel because what's coming next isn't just information, it's revelation. Stay alert, stay awake, and remember, they built the illusion, but you hold the vision. Stay blessed always.